Hello and welcome everyone to this crisis group online event where we will be discussing the Lebanon-Israel ceasefire. I have with me three colleagues who will take us through this discussion. Heiko Wimmen, who is the project director for Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq. Mairav Zonszein, who is the senior Israel analyst, and David Wood, our senior Lebanon analyst. My name is Lahib Hegel. I will be moderating the discussion. We will have about 30 minutes for a Q&A at the end. And you can field your questions throughout the conversation in the chat box, and we will aim to respond to as many of them towards the end of the session here. So the ceasefire is, of course, a welcome development. Lebanon and Israel reached an agreement on the 26th of November on the ceasefire between Israel and Hezbollah. US and French diplomats helped broker this deal. And this truce came a little more than 2 months after a year of tit-for-tat attacks between Israel and Hezbollah that escalated into a full-blown war. I am going to start with a question to you, David. If you can explain the timing of this agreement, why it happened now, and how it came about.
Sure. So as you just mentioned in the introduction, really the 2 months leading up to the ceasefire marked a massive change in the intensity of the conflict and created a lot of pressure on Hezbollah to move towards a ceasefire agreement. So the conflict initially started on the 8th of October 2023 when Hezbollah launched strikes into the disputed Shebaa farms in solidarity with Hamas and the Palestinian people. And from that point up until mid-September this year, the conflict remained a relatively limited war of attrition. So while most people in Lebanon were obviously looking on aghast at what was happening, especially in southern Lebanon with Israeli attacks there and, of course, Hezbollah's fire into northern Israel, the war did feel as though there were certain limits. That changed massively from mid-September, starting, of course, as all listeners would remember, with pager attacks, which occurred in places throughout Lebanon. And then soon after, Israel escalated its aerial bombardments of Lebanon with targeted assassinations of senior Hezbollah personnel and also intensive bombing in mostly Shia majority communities in southern Lebanon, Beirut's southern suburbs, and the Bekaa Valley. So after 2 months of this intense warfare, there was growing pressure on Hezbollah, which was facing not only the huge blows that it suffered as an organization to its military capacity, but also the fact that a displacement crisis, which escalated significantly in that time. More than well over 1 million people were displaced in Lebanon, many of them being members of the Shia community, which Hezbollah is deeply embedded inside. There was growing pressure to bring an end to the conflict and move towards some kind of settlement, which would allow people to regain something approximating normal life in Lebanon.
Thank you, David. So turning to you, Mairav, perhaps you can explain to us the rationale on the Israeli side for entering this agreement.
Thanks, Lahib, and good to be with everybody. I mean, Israel's been in a multi-front war, the longest war in its history since the Hamas attack on October 7th. And, you know, there's been a lot of attention on how Netanyahu, who is on trial for corruption and increasingly distrusted and unliked by the public in Israel and by the world, is interested in pursuing and persisting with endless war for his own political survival, and because he is in a coalition with very, very far-right members who really do, some of them believe in all-out war on all fronts, in destroying all of Israel's adversaries. And so the idea kind of, I think, in maybe outside of Israel, became that Netanyahu is interested in war in Lebanon endlessly. But actually, the military and I think the political echelon was not interested. First of all, it didn't start, this war, of course. Hezbollah started it. And Israel, since 2006, has prepared very, very carefully and in a calculated way to take out Hezbollah targets, which we've seen over the course of this war. But This was from the beginning defined as a limited war. Israel has forces in Gaza, in the West Bank. It has been dealing with the Houthis and Iran. So there's a lot on its plate. And it was interested in kind of trying to do what it could do to take out Hezbollah's arsenal. And I think that it has been quite successful in doing that. And it was in Israel's interest to come to the ceasefire. The thing is that now that we learn of kind of how the ceasefire came about and what is looking like on the ground, I think Netanyahu can really say that he achieved a lot of success. Because as opposed to 2006, he's taken out even more of Hezbollah's military capabilities. The military exposed the amount of weapons and infrastructure on the border and really removed the main threat, which was a ground incursion by the Radwan forces, which is essentially why Israel also evacuated some 60, 70,000 residents really in the hours after the October 7th attack, which is unprecedented in Israeli history. I mean, it was an evacuation not due to an invasion, but due to a threat of invasion. And that's something that has, I think, been really like a huge factor in how this ceasefire has been received and how the war has played out on the Israeli side, which I can get into later on. But I mean, from Israel's perspective, the entire multi-front war against Hamas, against Iran, against Hezbollah really shifted in terms of how it perceives itself, and I think probably how the world perceives it when it took out Nasrallah, when it had these pager attacks, and when it really changed the dynamic and kind of got the clear military upper hand. And I think from that position, it felt much more comfortable, even though, as I'll get into later, the public is not happy with the ceasefire, but they can defend it militarily at this point.
Okay, great. Let's indeed get back to that later. But to come to the terms of the agreement, Heiko, could you take us through the outline of the ceasefire agreement and maybe also how it compares to past agreements like Resolution 1701?
Well, exactly. I mean, what this ceasefire, or maybe this pause or end to hostilities does is it actually says that 1701, you mentioned, of 2006, should finally be implemented as it was supposed to be. Back then, 2006, of course, Hezbollah and Israel fought a war for 1 month, and then that resolution ended that war back then. Now, the idea is the same. The area south of the Litani River, like 6 to 25, 30 kilometers from the Israeli border, up north of the Israeli border, should have no armed groups. Of course, they mean Hezbollah before anybody else. There should be no armed groups, no armed non-state groups. Only the Lebanese state and security forces should be there. Whoever is there as armed group should withdraw. And then going forward, the Lebanese state should work on taking away the arms of non-state groups in all of Lebanon, securing the border, preventing that these groups rearm. Most of that is in 1701 in very similar language. And of course, most importantly, there's a timetable for withdrawal, 60 days, right? There are some things that are not in the ceasefire and that are somehow still implicitly part of the agreement. Supposedly, there is some kind of so-called side letter from the United States to Israel. And that letter, or those guarantees, essentially tell the Israelis, okay, if you go and continue hitting what you think are immediate threats to your security, and of course, we're talking here about Hezbollah assets, whatever, of rocket launchers or whatever it might be, what the Israelis find as a threat, then you can do that. You can, apparently that's also in the side letter, you can do overflights, which are of course violations of Lebanese airspace. And Israelis have indeed used that license, I think we can call it, profusely over the past week, right? I mean, so it has been enforced for a week. UNIFIL apparently in one interview with CNN, some UNIFIL source said that on Sunday, so that's after 3 or 4 days, they had already tabulated about 100 Israeli ceasefire violations. And there's one major innovation to 1701 in this agreement, which is that there is a monitoring mechanism. It's called, so there has been something similar before, but this now is much more heavyweight. Supposedly, the US are in it. The US is the chair. There's a US general is already in Lebanon who's supposed to be the chair. The French are in, which the Israelis in the beginning, or Netanyahu himself, wasn't exactly happy about. But now the French are in. And then, of course, the Lebanese, UNIFIL, and Israel. So this is a mechanism that should deal with these violations. So in theory, if the Israelis spot something that they think should not happen, should not be there according to the ceasefire, they should tell the mechanism that there's something off, and they should do something about it. How this then works in practice? So, what if Lebanon and Israel have different interpretations of an incident? Like Lebanon says this is an infraction, it's a violation. Israel says no, it isn't. And then who decides what is a violation? Is there a vote? Does the chairman decide? We don't know that. The ceasefire agreement doesn't say anything about that. And then how can this mechanism actually give orders to the Lebanese government or the Lebanese army to actually do that? So all these technicalities are unclear, and the violations that we have seen for the past week, or the testing of the ceasefire, if you want, it's not clear if the mechanism has done anything about it. There are no publicized meetings. Maybe there are like discrete communications behind the scenes where like the members of the mechanism tell one or the other party, okay, cool this, don't escalate here. We talk to this. We don't know that exactly, but there is a big question mark on what is this mechanism actually going to work. How does that relate to this side letter? How is it going? All this stuff this is going to implement it, and that is, let's say that's a point of failure.
Okay,
probably could be.
Thank you. We can come back more to the compliance questions later, but I want to turn to David to hear first. So, how has the ceasefire agreement been received in Lebanon?
Yeah, so in Lebanon, I think as you would expect, there's an overwhelming feeling of relief, not just from Hezbollah supporters and the Lebanese Shia community in general, but all Lebanese. I mean, as I mentioned earlier, it really felt in the last 2 months leading up to the ceasefire that it became a war that affected all Lebanese and not just in limited areas of the country. As one indication of that, you have that 84% of deaths in the conflict in Lebanon came in that 2-month period. So there was an overwhelming sense of relief that perhaps people could go back to a more normal life. But there is still there are divisions that exist over what happened in the war and what it means for Lebanon's future. So Hezbollah has projected a victory narrative based on how the war ended, and it has emphasized that despite the severe blows that it suffered throughout the war, and especially in the last 2 months, that it still managed to maintain its aerial and land operations against Israel. So in that sense, it wasn't forced to stand down, and that it entered into a ceasefire agreement that also Israel wanted. It points out that in the ceasefire agreement itself, Israel made certain demands that weren't met. One of them is, as Heiko just mentioned before, that apparently there's this side letter guaranteeing that Washington will support Israel's right to act militarily if it perceives a threat inside Lebanon or sees that Hezbollah is rearming itself. But that wasn't included as an explicit term of the agreement. You could also point to this idea of on the monitoring committee that Israel originally wanted to have the United Kingdom and Germany having representatives on the committee as well, who was seen as reliably pro-Israeli. That demand too was dropped, and now it's just the United States and France alongside UNIFIL, the UN peacekeeping force in Lebanon, and Lebanon and Israel on this monitoring mechanism. However, there are many others in Lebanon who are not convinced by this victory narrative. So while the party faithful came out and as they returned to their homes when the ceasefire was announced, many were displaying Hezbollah flags and pictures of the slain Secretary General Hassan Nasrallah. Many other Lebanese are not convinced by this at all and perceive this as a war that, from Lebanon's perspective, was totally unnecessary, that brought an enormous amount of destruction and death upon the country. And there's a push, especially from Hezbollah's most staunch domestic opponents, to fully implement this ceasefire agreement, to push for Hezbollah's complete disarmament, with a view to making sure that this kind of conflict won't come up again in the future in Lebanon.
Thank you, David. Mairav, you already mentioned that the ceasefire agreement hasn't necessarily been very well received in Israel. So perhaps you can explain why that is.
Yeah, first I just want to point out that it's interesting how on both sides there's been kind of the ability to provide a victory narrative, right? I mean, Hezbollah affected the entire country pretty much. It showed that it's able to attack military bases with precise intelligence. It even attacked Netanyahu's private residence. And Israel was not able to, it was able to intercept rockets, but it's not able to intercept anti-tank missiles. And there's been a very big difficulty in intercepting drones, even though the majority were intercepted ultimately. But it really challenged Israel in a way that we have never experienced before. And people were in shelters constantly, certainly in northern cities. And so on the one hand, Hezbollah could say, look, we did this. And on the other hand, as I said before, Israel, clearly has the upper hand. And obviously the casualties on the Lebanese side are much greater. There's no air force over our heads here in Israel. But, there should be relief in Israel that there's, not daily rocket sirens, that most cities now are not being targeted. But it's not met that way primarily because of the displaced residents who have been very, very vocal about the fact that they still don't know when they can go home. They don't feel like this is a clear win. And the days now in the ceasefire in large part might determine, right, how they start to, because it's going to be a curve. It's going to have to be tested in the field in real time. But their argument is effectively that there cannot be any inhabitants, any Lebanese people, no matter who they are, on the border, because we know from experience, as far as they're concerned, that the people who live in those villages are Shiites and they're identified with Hezbollah, and that's where they hide their weapons. And from there, they set up positions. And so they want that area depopulated. They don't want people going back. And that is an interesting part of the ceasefire that is not anywhere in it. There's no security buffer zone. There's nothing of the sort. But in the last few days, we've seen that Israel has de facto implemented a no-go zone. It's shot at people who have come into that zone, warning shots, tried to apprehend people. And so it'll be interesting to see how long that can be held up, and whether residents will feel like that is a new reality that helps them feel a sense of security, real security and a sense of security. But the bigger picture here is that also something I think most people don't see outside Israel is that with everything that's been going on in the south, with Gaza and the high price of this war on Israel's budget, and the amount of reservists that have been serving, that Israel hasn't really budgeted enough money for those displaced residents. And they've had to start a new school year now where many of them have moved, right? They don't know when they can go back. So their children have started a new school year, and they don't have any timeline or budget from the government as to when their houses will be repaired and how they're going to be able to go back home. So they also feel just neglected in general as a sector. And that is also, and then there's of course the fact that many of them, even whether they're right-wing or left-wing, if they're right-wing, then they've pushed for Israel to continue the campaign. If we've gotten this far with Hezbollah, let's go all the way, right? Let's push for a few more months. We can get 95% of their arsenal hit. We can really show that we will go all the way to ensure that. And I think there's also an element that it's not enough to stop the fire, because of course the fear is that will just allow Hezbollah to rebuild, and they don't trust the mechanism and they don't trust the Lebanese army. And they only trust the IDF to ensure that, right? So the next 60 days will really make a huge difference in how that's received. But beyond that, and this was something that was going on in the last few weeks, I think, with Israel's military successes, there started to be some talk about how far can Hezbollah's weakness, how far can we damage them to the point that the Lebanese public and the politicians are able to kind of retake hold of the state, of the army. I think that's something that Israelis very much want to see. They want to see, a different Lebanon, where the monopoly of force and the monopoly of power is not with Hezbollah. And that's obviously a very lofty goal that I don't think Israel actually has an agenda to do that, but I think it was trying to see how far it could push. And I think a lot of the public who's been affected by this war want to see a real political resolution, not just a military one, but one that is long lasting, because as far as they're concerned, if it goes the way it went in 2006, then we're going to be in another round in 5, 10, 15 years, whatever it is. And then the other thing to keep in mind in terms of how it's perceived in Israel is that Hezbollah is a much scarier and bigger adversary than Hamas. And for some, and for many people who have been publicly protesting weeks and weeks, every week for a year for a hostage deal, which the military has also gotten behind in Gaza, and for an end to the war. And then for Netanyahu to go and end the war with Hezbollah when they appear to be a much bigger adversary than Hamas makes a lot of Israelis say, okay, this is proof that that he's not interested in a hostage deal. He's not interested in ending the war because he could do the same thing with with Hamas that he's doing with Hezbollah. He could take a pause, he could regroup, and he could always attack again because the political echelon. I mean, there's the political echelon that wants to settle Gaza, and then there's the political echelon and Netanyahu who say we can't stop because we need to continue to destroy Hamas. But everybody in Israel kind of feels like you can just do what you need to do, right? The way they're doing what they need to do militarily in Lebanon, they could do the same thing in Gaza. So basically, there's a lot of resentment about the fact that there is still not a hostage deal and that we're now in the second year, we're now going into the winter, and the hostages are still in Gaza. So that's also part of, I think, the general feeling like the ceasefire in Lebanon is not adequate.
Okay, thank you, Mairav. We'll try to circle back to the Gaza question as well towards the end, but let's stick with this agreement for a bit. David, I was wondering, so based on what Mairav said here, where the ceasefire agreement is not necessarily very popular, people don't believe in it, and Israel seems to be pushing the limits as well of the agreement. What behavior do you see from Hezbollah going forward? Like, would they adhere to this kind of 60-day timeline for withdrawal, for instance, or other terms of the agreement?
Sure. So I think in terms of the first question that you're driving at there, it is, I guess, how likely is Hezbollah to fire back or to attack Israel again, despite the ceasefire being in place? And we've already seen one incident on Monday where Hezbollah launched 2 mortars into disputed territory near the Israel-Lebanon border in what it said was a warning to Israel in response to Israel's military operations during the ceasefire period. Now, earlier than that, a senior Hezbollah politician had said to media that Hezbollah would leave it to the Lebanese army, which was authorized to prevent Israeli violations. But obviously, it took the decision to take that matter into its own hands, at least in that sort of symbolic way. But that operation in itself, by the way, firing those 2 mortar shells provoked quite a severe response from Israel, which led to airstrikes causing several deaths. So I think from Hezbollah, it seems as though, at least in the earliest days of the ceasefire, it's trying to be a bit reticent about actively attacking Israel. But of course, if Israel continues to escalate military operations, that could change. In terms of the other obligations that the ceasefire deal imposes on Hezbollah, mainly in terms of allowing for its infrastructure to be withdrawn and dismantled, I think we need to really separate geographically on this one. So a lot of people in response to the ceasefire deal, thinking in the logic of UN Resolution 1701, were thinking that it really focused purely on Hezbollah assets south of the Litani River, so close to the border. But in fact, the terms of the ceasefire agreement, and indeed the terms of 1701, don't just cover armed non-state actors south of the Litani, but also the military assets north of the Litani in the rest of the country. And yesterday I read that Donald Trump's incoming Middle East advisor, Massad Boulos, clarified that point, saying that no, this agreement applies to disarmament or calls for disarmament, not just south of the Litani, but also north of the Litani. Now, like it did in 2006, it seems like Hezbollah is happy to withdraw its military assets and fighters south of the Litani, but it sent pretty clear signals in Lebanon as soon as the ceasefire was announced that it doesn't have any intention of disbanding its military operations altogether. So I think there's obviously a regional element to this. This general regional confrontation isn't over. A lot will depend on what happens with Iran. You know, how willing is Iran, depending on how things go in the coming weeks and months, to contribute to rebuilding Hezbollah. Will it be possible for Hezbollah to rearm in the same way it did after 2006, given the events in Syria and the potential that its supply lines are going to be cut off? Another factor might be how will Hezbollah's domestic opponents approach the group, and will they either try to push Hezbollah to disarm immediately, or would they be willing to enter into a dialogue over a longer term to discuss integrating Hezbollah's weapons into the Lebanese armed forces? So all of these questions are unknowns, but I think for the minute, while we can pretty safely predict that all things going well, Hezbollah will support the Lebanese army in its efforts south of Litani, in the rest of the country is a different question.
Thank you, David. Okay, so let's build on that with you, Heiko. In terms of the Lebanese government and the Lebanese armed forces, to what degree will they be able to comply with their obligations? Are they realistic?
Well, I mean, it is a very, very tall order, right? You know, so I mean, so let's start with the political level. And we're talking about Lebanon, right? Lebanese obligations, which I mean, presuming that the Lebanese state is capable of functioning in a way that many other states function. You have a government, that government takes decisions by majority, and then these are implemented, and the army responds to the civilian authorities. It doesn't exactly work this way around here. Hezbollah and the other big Shiite party, Amal, you know, they together monopolize the political representation of the Shiite community, which is one of the big communities in Lebanon. Now, the way the Lebanese political system is built, if you monopolize the political representation of one of the major communities, you have veto power. You can block any process. You can block electing a president, as has been the case for 2 years now. You can block forming a government, which has been the case in numerous times, and which is the case now. We have a caretaker government, a government that arguably doesn't even have the constitutional, political, or legal authority to give any instructions to anybody. And it's very clear that if the attempt was made to ram that through politically, to have the government instructing the army to do things that Hezbollah and Amal explicitly reject, this is in the political system, is not going to work. Now, if you try to cut through this to these restrictions somehow, if the army is indeed, on whatever basis, legal comments or analysis, is actually sent to do things that Hezbollah does not want it to do, you're courting disaster, right? I mean, you have to expect an answer. That answer could be violent, and a confrontation between the army and Hezbollah has potential to test and really destroy the integrity of the army. And we had a conversation, David and I, here a month ago with an Egyptian, sorry, should have said an Arab diplomat, but never mind, it was an Egyptian diplomat who said, you all haven't heard that, right? Who basically said, look, if you do this, you are risking the only institution of the Lebanese state that is actually still standing. You know, the last pillar of the Lebanese state that is still standing. You're gambling on that, and that's maybe not a good idea. So that's for the political end. Now, talking about material capability, I mean, Lebanon has been in an economic crisis for 5 years. The army is desperately underfunded. It was always desperately underfunded. For the past 5 years, these soldiers are not getting salaries that they can live on. They have to moonlight. Many of them are only part-time soldiers, and sometimes the army doesn't even have enough gas to put fuel in the cars. So already, if you try to imagine the situation in the south now, you have tens of thousands of people coming back. These tens of thousands of people are coming, and now they're coming with cars that have mattresses on the top of the car. Tomorrow they'll come in with trucks and vans to bring building material, right? In theory, if the army wants to clear that area of Hezbollah arms, wants to make sure that there's no influx. They have to start searching at least some of these vehicles. They have to do surveillance of building sites to make sure that nothing is built in there, but is perhaps a clandestine military structure again. They have to do all these things. They're probably going to get instructions from this mechanism. Oh, there's something here, there's something there. Go and check it. And at the same time removing all the infrastructure that is there. So then after that, then that's only south of the Litan. So now then they're supposed to secure the border with Syria to cut supply lines. That border is 320 kilometers long. Nobody has ever been able to secure it. On the Syrian side, they cannot expect much help at this point. The Syrian army is fighting for its life. Further north, so they have to do it by themselves. There are smugglers that ply these routes, these border crossings. These smugglers, some of them are armed, quite dangerous people. And then there's the internal situation. I mean, so that diplomat noted, it's the only pillar still standing. The Lebanese army is one of the very few institutions that still has credibility in all parts of the Lebanese population. If you have any kind of altercations, which you can imagine many with all these displaced around, and not all of them will be able to return before it really gets winter. If you have altercations, if you have any security issue, in the end you need the army to fix it. And with that, in the army in the current state that is, I think this order, the list of tasks that they're supposed to do is very, very long. They need massive support. If they don't get massive support, it's a mission impossible. So there's really something. I mean, if external actors want to do something to make this work, plow money into the army. That's is the one recommendation we can give without any hesitation.
Okay, thank you for that, Heiko. It doesn't sound very promising. Mairav, I'll come back to you quickly then. So based on this, and already you mentioned sort of the Israeli concerns about what the Lebanese can actually do. What do you think about Israeli compliance going forward?
I mean, well, the thing is, we don't really understand what is a violation and what isn't a violation and who decides what the violation is. And this side letter has not been confirmed by the US in any explicit manner. It has been reported on in Israeli media. And I have been told by an official that they do have, that they are under the understanding that they can fly drones for, collecting intelligence and surveillance, and whether the side letter exists or not, they're doing it, and it's happening, right? So, and the US obviously is fine with that, but all these violations, we don't really understand exactly what they are and what amounts to a violation, what doesn't, and how that's going to be enforced. So from what I understand, Israel has a lot of, as Netanyahu said, freedom of military action in all of Lebanon. And in some cases, it could collapse the ceasefire. And in other cases, it might help, to prevent the transfer of arms and to keep a reality on the ground near the border that at least tries to simulate what both sides would ideally want to have happen, right? Which is that there is no Hezbollah armed in that area. But that's something that it's very hard to foresee at this point. There clearly is political will by both sides to have a ceasefire. And it's also very likely that, as we saw throughout the almost 20 years since 2006 and now, that no matter what you put on paper, no matter what's discussed at the table, Hezbollah and Israel really determine the reality on the ground in real time in terms of how the kind of rules of the game, the tacit rules of the game, the way they communicate with each other, essentially, through how they respond militarily. So I think, Israel, as I said in the outset, it has an interest in keeping this front closed, but it also is very, very, I think, clear that it's not going to allow a repeat of 2006. And what it wants is implementation. But as we've all outlined here, the actual implementation is the problem, is the challenge. And I heard Amos Hochstein, the envoy who helped get this a ceasefire together, he said in a webinar or in an interview, I don't remember, that like Heiko said, that Lebanon needs a lot of help. The Lebanese army needs a lot of support. And without providing that, mostly in funding, but maybe in other ways, then Iran and Hezbollah will ultimately fill that vacuum again. So I don't know what measures are going to be taken by the U.S., which has taken a very leading role in the ceasefire and in the day after reality. But I think it's clear on the Israeli side that as long as it's capable of doing this without collapsing the ceasefire, it's going to continue to act to shape how this quote unquote new reality should look like in Lebanon. So it's going to comply to the extent that it sees that it's able to get away with it. And I think it's understandable that Israel has interest in it, especially now before the IDF has withdrawn, in trying to do its best to enforce what it sees as a Hezbollah-free zone as much as possible near the border.
Okay, thank you. So actually, just a follow-up question then. What do you expect of the U.S. role going forward, especially considering that we're expecting a new administration in the next 2 months?
I mean, I heard a report that I saw a report that the U.S. pressured Israel after the 2 mortar shells by Hezbollah to not bomb Beirut. That's what Israel supposedly wanted to do in response, to send a clear message, and the U.S., I think it was Sullivan, pressured Israel not to do so. The fact that it was reported in that way makes me think that this was all kind of staged, and it's kind of a way to play the game, that the U.S. is playing its role, but it could be that Israel was going to bomb Beirut and the U.S. managed to tone things down. If the U.S. can be that player behind the scenes to restrain Israel to the extent that it can, or that it wants to, then that's a positive step. I don't know if I really don't know if the U.S. has plans, or the French or otherwise, in terms of providing, like Heiko said, actual, streaming of money into the Lebanese army. I'm not aware of such a plan, but that would obviously, be extremely helpful. And then in terms of Trump, I mean, he has this new Middle East envoy who has ties to Lebanon. He's talked, to the Lebanese Americans about how he wants an end to the war. So, there's a lot of talk in the direction of going forward with a ceasefire in a positive way. But, the proof will be in the pudding. And I really don't know, what Trump is going to do.
Thanks, Mairav. Heiko, I see that you have your hand up, and perhaps you will answer this question as well, but I'll let you answer whatever you want. But I want you to come back to so you did mention the recommendation of the Lebanese armed forces needing a lot of financial support, and Mairav mentioned that Amos Hochstein has indeed acknowledged this. So do you expect the Americans to do this? Are there others that could do this?
Yeah, so I mean, first I wanted to add to Mairav mentioned already Massad Boulos, the advisor or envoy for Arab affairs, who also happens to be the son-in-law of the president, right? Sorry, the father of the son-in-law of the president. No, that was another son-in-law, right? The last time around. Massad Boulos actually gave an interview, I think yesterday, to Le Point, a French magazine, and at least in the interview, I mean, at least he was very well briefed on what's in the ceasefire and came up with his own, with comments that looked very informed. So we agree to them or don't agree to them, but it would seem that he would take an active interest in that from this. Now, concerning the money, I mean, the US have funded the Lebanese army before. You know, they have given stipends. That program was discontinued at some point. It's legally a bit tricky, so from what I understand, for the US to explicitly fund a foreign military. But it has been done before. They found ways around whatever legal complications there might be. So that's that. There was this meeting in Paris, I think a month ago or 2 months ago. I'm not sure exactly when there was or was it earlier? Somebody help me. David, you know that, right? When was it?
In October. That's what I'm here
Okay,
for.
so 2 month period, yeah, a month and a half before then, yeah. So apparently the French managed to raise $200 million for the Lebanese army, right? In that meeting, commitments, pledges, whatever. I mean, we know that such pledges are. I mean, you usually have to like reduce quite a bit of it of what is pledged there. I mean, it's in reality it will be much less, probably, you know. But I mean, I think there is some willingness to do that. I guess there are other candidates, the Qataris perhaps, who may be ready to pitch in, and I think a lot really depends on how this is working going forward. You know, I mean, if there is a positive trend can be seen, that this goes, that you can get the idea that this is generally going in the right direction. You know, I think there may be more volunteers to come. And sorry, Laib, I forgot the other question you asked. Was that?
It's okay. I think we'll move on to David, and because we need to go into the Q&A, but it'll come up again. David.
Sorry, just to add one thing on US funding. While I think that there does seem to be a real interest in the US in funding the Lebanese army so that it can fulfill its obligations under the ceasefire agreement. On the other hand, there have been ideas that I think we'd consider quite concerning that have come out from some US lawmakers, which is to condition funding to the LAF, which is heavily dependent on US funding. It's by far its biggest supporter, on its ability to confront Hezbollah or its willingness to confront Hezbollah. Now, obviously, ideally, the way this ceasefire agreement will work is that it won't require confronting Hezbollah, that Hezbollah will cooperate in good faith with the agreement and allow it to be implemented properly. But this would be a cautionary note to people in Washington who might think that kind of pressure can be used to apply it to the Lebanese army and to tie its funding to its performance in implementing the ceasefire agreement, is just to remain mindful that this is not actually a decision that's necessarily in the army itself's hands. The army not only requires the political backing to carry out the agreement, but also needs the resources in the first place. So I think it's just a degree of patience to be shown towards the Lebanese army in implementing this agreement, not just in Washington, but also in Israel, I'd say.
Thank you very much for that, David. So before I open up for the questions from the audience, I just wanted to circle back to you, Mairav, on the Gaza question. So what does this ceasefire agreement, if it has any bearing at all in terms of the prospects of a ceasefire in Gaza?
Well, ostensibly none, but, I forgot to mention that I think one of the main, achievements of the ceasefire for Israel is that it decoupled the fronts, right? Nasrallah was very clear that as long as there's a bombardment and destruction in Gaza, that he will continue to bomb northern Israel. And Israel took him out and essentially changed that formula, and was able to close out that front. So on the one hand, that is a success for Israel. On the other hand, it leaves Hamas, as Israeli military analysts and commentators have been saying, it leaves Hamas isolated. This is, in some ways what Israel wanted, but so that it could, Hamas has lost this axis of resistance. Israel took a big blow against Iran's defense systems in an attack in Iran last month, or in October, I can't remember now. But, effectively with everybody weak and Hamas isolated and Hamas not getting this huge kind of war against Israel that it would have liked, it should supposedly, as far as Israel is concerned, compromise and agree to release the hostages without necessarily calling for a full withdrawal of troops or an end to the war. But so it isolates Hamas, but at the same time, it puts all the focus now in Israel, as I mentioned earlier, on why there's no hostage deal after so long. And there's two elements to that which I mentioned. And there is renewed pressure. There's been talks in Cairo, apparently. There's renewed efforts by the Biden administration, at least rhetorically, for a hostage deal. Also, Hamas has released a video recently of an American Israeli soldier still alive, held captive. That's the first documentation of a soldier in custody in this war. And I think that was a clear message by Hamas saying, like, we have these people, some of them are Americans, some of them are soldiers. If you want to get them, then we need to end the war. But to get to the point, I mean, the main obstacle to a ceasefire and hostage deal between Israel and Hamas has been that Netanyahu and the Israeli government have refused to actually end the war. They've refused to pull out troops fully and end the war. They are interested, unlike with Hezbollah, in completely dismantling Hamas as a military and governing power. And a year and 2 months in, they still haven't done that. So they argue that they need to continue. And then there's also the element, as I mentioned, of the far right in power, which wants very openly to resettle Gaza. Israel has already built a huge military base bifurcating the strip. It could be there for a very long time, and there could be settlements that come out of it. And that's been part of the push by the government. So there's, so on the one hand, there's a lot more focus now on the hostage deal. There's also the Trump, not tweet, but he posted on Truth this kind of ultimatum that nobody understands what that means or how he would do it. But there's, interestingly, a clear focus by both Trump and Biden right now. Together, they both want this hostage deal, right? So, and in some ways, Trump has kind of signaled to Biden that he wants it to happen before he takes office on January 20th. So presumably, they could even be working together to make this happen. But the sticking points are still the same. And so Israel likes to kind of portray that now Hamas is isolated and it might compromise. Maybe it'll allow the military to stay in certain parts of the strip for longer periods. But ultimately, as far as I know, there's no real movement there. And the ceasefire in Lebanon does not necessarily have a direct effect on the feasibility of a ceasefire and hostage deal in Gaza.
Right. Thank you very much, Mairav. So actually, you partly answered a question that came up from the audience. So I'll repeat that in case David and Heiko also have a take on this. So what do you think about President-elect Trump's recent post on Truth social media platform exhorting the release of the hostages by January 20th, or else there will be hell to pay, in quotation marks. So I don't know if Heiko and David, if you have any other take on this. Not necessarily.
I mean, look. I think it's pretty clear that that we now in a way we are in limbo, right? We're in limbo between these two administrations, and it's clear that the regional environment will bear on this. I mean, the regional environment will decide will I think be important to what extent Hezbollah may be ready to show itself in a cooperative mode. If the Iranians get the impression that Trump is open for deals, I mean, this idea is around, like that he's maybe a conservative, he's a hawk, he's very extremely pro-Israel and all of that kind of stuff, but he's also a deal maker, so maybe we can make a deal with it, and nobody really knows, like where this goes. So if it goes into this direction of deal exploring, can there be a deal, then I think then maybe you can actually create that could create a positive dynamics. But right now, I mean, this is really an unknown. We don't know where this is going. We don't know in which direction that goes. You have Masad Boulos again. I mean, we stay in the Lebanese theater. Is supposedly, I mean, reportedly he has some personal relation to a Lebanese politician, Samir Frangi, who's like seen in the as being in the Hezbollah camp. He was, or maybe still is, the Hezbollah like the preferred candidate for president on the Hezbollah end. So these are like all things that we can't really know how this is going to fall into place, and maybe he's going to be a raging bull in the porcelain store and blow it all up, and I don't know how he'll make maybe the Iranians pay hell as being supposedly the patrons of Hamas. Who knows? I don't think anybody can have that, can know that now, and everybody is basically preparing and positioning themselves for the various possible scenarios, because we don't know.
Okay. So let me continue with the questions from the audience. So I think that you and David covered this to some degree, but still, if there is anything to add, do you think the Lebanese government and the Lebanese army are capable of demilitarizing Hezbollah? And I will add another question to it from another person. So do you think that Hezbollah will simply hand over its weapons? And would Iran allow that to happen? So what would their position be on this? I don't know if David or Heiko, who wants to start?
I can offer a few thoughts if you like. I think that in terms of would Hezbollah just hand over its weapons, as Heiko mentioned, and we've been speaking about a bit in this talk, a lot of that will depend on the regional environment. So does Iran want to double down on its project, which includes Hezbollah, in terms of projecting strength through state armed actors, or is it going to go down a different path? I think for now, we don't really know that. I think also for Hezbollah, we need to remember that its weapons have been a source of legitimacy and power for it, which applies on the domestic scene as well, not just on the regional. So Hezbollah and its supporters are aware that, especially following the 2006 war, the fact that it had this increasingly intimidating military infrastructure did give it a certain amount of clout, which was also reflected on the political scene. So following in 2008, some people might remember that Hezbollah responded to what it saw as an unfavorable government decision by sending fighters into Beirut, and there was clashes around the country, which resulted in the Doha Accords. And after those, Hezbollah had a permanent place for the institutions and like a concrete manifestation of a veto over a Lebanese political decision. So I think that Hezbollah's weapons, while members of the party have said that at some point they might be willing to enter into a dialogue to integrate those weapons into the Lebanese army and state institutions, that would not be something that the party would necessarily concede without some sort of quid pro quo arrangement. So even I was speaking a couple of months ago to the leader of a prominent Christian party, which is a staunch opponent of Hezbollah, and he was saying that even in his view, while he thinks that Hezbollah should disarm as soon as possible, that it's not realistic to expect Hezbollah to just give up its weapons and not have some sort of political concession for the Shia community. So he suggested, for example, that perhaps as part of a national dialogue, there could be discussions about allowing more seats in government that are reserved for the Shia to compensate for that concession. So again, these kinds of details will only come out over time, and this is more a long-term discussion than something that can be solved tomorrow. But without a doubt, Hezbollah, as things stand right now, I can't imagine a scenario where it would immediately hand over all of its weapons.
Thank you, David. Heiko?
Yeah, I think I fully agree with David, of course, but just to add, I think we need to. One thing that is necessary to understand is that that Hezbollah is in politics, or not to be in politics. Hezbollah is in politics because at some point it decided that it needed a foothold in the Lebanese institutions to make sure that these institutions could not be used by anybody to force it to give up its arms, right? So politics for Hezbollah is not an objective in it by itself. Politics is a means to an end. It's not the end. The weapons, on the other hand, are actually an end in itself. So if Hezbollah was founded was established as a armed resistance organization. So that's the DNA of the organization. That's what they were made for, and if the moment they stop to be that, there's a big question mark. Why is this organization even there? If it's about getting bigger shares of the Shiite community, why do you need two parties? There's already one who does that. I mean, Nabi Berri and Amal. I mean, that's the big distribution machine for the pieces of the cake that go to the Shia community. So and I don't want to suggest that this is something that cannot happen. But it basically means that this party would have to very thoroughly transform itself, its understanding, its sense of purpose, its ideological basis sits very uneasily with this idea. The one thing that David also mentioned concerning handing over the weapons to the Lebanese state, or rather integrating the armed parts of Hezbollah into the Lebanese army. I mean, that idea has been around for a while, and it was actually discussed already in 2006. Actually before the war, right? Because this question of what are the arms for came up the moment in 2000, the moment Israel withdrew from southern Lebanon, most of it, in 2000, that question was there. What are these arms still there for? And there was a long discussion. There was a national dialogue about, can Hezbollah maybe integrate itself into, or the armed part, into the Lebanese army? But of course, there was always the question in the end, and Rahib, you are Iraqi, you are very familiar to the problem. If you have paramilitaries who become part of official state forces, who sits on top of the decision-making process? Who, in the end, gives the army the orders to these paramilitaries who are non-militaries? Where exactly is their loyalty? And these questions have. They're always very difficult to resolve. And I had a discussion with somebody who's very close to Nabi Berri about this particular question. And I asked him that exactly. And he told me, look, this would then be a domestic Lebanese problem, not a problem of the region, not a problem of Israel, not a problem of the US. But I fear Israel will disagree. Israel would think that it's very much an Israeli problem if there's a part of the Lebanese military where we don't know exactly, or we can't be 100% sure. Do they answer to the army command? Do they answer to the Lebanese government? Or do they answer to the leadership of Hezbollah? Do they answer to Iran? So I think this is a very big discussion, and it's not something that can be definitely answer with yes or no at this point, and it's also not something that can happen from one day or to the other or in a very short period of time.
Thank you, Heiko, for explaining the complexity of this. Mairav, so I want to pose two questions to you from the audience, and I can help you answer the latter of this. But first, do you think the IDF will target the pro-Iranian militias in Iraq in preparation to bomb the nuclear reactors in Iran? And then number two, to what extent will a holding ceasefire prompt greater action against Israel from the Iraqi PMUs, the Popular Mobilization Forces, or the Houthis, etc.?
So on the first question, I think those are two separate issues. First of all, Israel, as much as it would like maybe to attack nuclear reactors in Iran, it doesn't have the capability to do so, as far as I'm aware, and as far as I think most experts have said. It would definitely need the US to do that. And it's very plausible that Netanyahu is planning to do that with Trump, or that's what he wants to do. He's built his career on, countering Iran's nuclear program. So that's one thing. But as far as attacking the Iranian militias in Iraq, that's, I think, a separate story. And I'm happy for Lahib to take it from there. But they have been firing on Israel from Iraq. A lot of them don't actually reach Israeli territory, and similar to the Houthis, although the Houthis have been more successful, they're not really that successful or a major threat. But the more that they've been firing from Iraq, the more the rhetoric in Israel has been that we will respond on Iraqi territory. I'm inclined to think that that's mostly rhetoric and that they're not actually going to do that anytime soon, but I don't know. But those are, I think, are two separate issues. And I'm happy for Lahib to keep going.
Yeah, so I think that it's unlikely that we will see more attacks now that there is a ceasefire. Even before Hezbollah entered the ceasefire, there was a drop towards the end of November. And the reason for this, I think, was a combination of things. So first of all, obviously, Israel had started threatening to strike Iraq ever since its retaliation on Iran, after which they were claiming that the Iranians were planning an attack from Iraq or in combination with Iraqi groups, and that there had been movement of weapons from Iran to Iraq. Now, most of the attacks that these groups have conducted have happened from Syrian territory, but Iraqi groups conducting them from there. So I think that this really alerted the Iraqi government. They put a lot of pressure on these groups to tone it down. But I think knowing that Hezbollah was about to enter a deal was probably had the main effect here. So why would they be doing this if Hezbollah isn't there? It doesn't mean that they won't again, but add to this now the turmoil in Syria, where the Assad regime is under threat. I think the Iraqi groups will be focusing their efforts there, although one of the main ones, Kataib Hezbollah, has said very clearly that they haven't made a decision yet, and that the support of Hamas is still very important going forward, meaning that we can't rule out continued attacks on Israel. But for now, it seems to be very much on the low, and that's probably continued to be the case for quite a while. Okay, I think that there was, sorry, I need to go back here to the longer list. So maybe to continue on Syria, then there is a question here in terms of what the implications you see from the current HTS offensive in Syria and the weakness or potential end of Assad. Maybe Heiko, you want to take this question?
Yeah, sure. So right now, I mean, again, it depends on how this campaign unfolds, right? I mean, so apparently, currently the front line is, last time I checked, was somewhere north of Hama. The rebels seem to make a real effort to take the city, and if Hama is taken, I mean, then I think we are getting closer to a situation where the supply lines to Hezbollah that go through by Homs and then to Qusayr on the border, this is the main entry point. There may be at some point a real threat to these supply lines, and also this is something that is certainly that certainly is should be on their mind or is on their mind. From all we know, Hezbollah had already withdrawn many of their, probably most of their fighters from these areas around Aleppo, because simply they needed them in Lebanon, of course. So I don't think that there's a direct threat or direct effect in that way from there. The big question mark is, of course, or there's speculations. Let's say there's speculations that Assad may be forced to cooperate with demands of like severing these supply lines to save his head. And I think these are pretty wild speculations. This idea, that you could somehow pry away Syria from the alliance with Iran with the right combination of incentives and threats. Now it would be mostly threats. That idea has been around forever. For as long as I look at Syria, it has never really worked that way. So right now, I don't think the effect is direct or imminent or immediate. Now, if we imagine a situation where the rebels march all the way to Damascus and take over, that's different. Very different, obviously. In the end, Syria is the strategic depth for Hezbollah. That's where the supply lines go. That's where, when you have to evacuate people from Lebanon, that's where you take them, and then maybe further on to Iraq or other places. But it's the direct border. That will be a huge change, but I think that is a bridge that is still pretty far away.
Thank you, Heiko. Okay, so perhaps this question initially to Mairav, and then David and Heiko, feel free to come in as well. So can the UN, especially UNIFIL, play a more decisive role to ensure a ceasefire agreement due to the negative Israeli sentiment towards UN institutions?
Yeah, I mean, the answer is kind of in the question. And I'll let Heiko and David talk more about UNIFIL. I think they're better placed. But I mean, when you talk to Israeli officials about UNIFIL, I mean, there's also like a going, just in general, UNIFIL and peacekeeping forces, there's a satirical skit that was going around Israel a few days ago about how the peacekeeping forces like drink wine and hand over the, give Hezbollah like the arms they need to dig the tunnels and all that. So basically, Israelis don't rely on UNIFIL at all, and there's no trust there. So that's my contribution.
David, do you want to go?
Sure. I mean, I think that UNIFIL has obviously been hamstrung in a sense in terms of implementing 1701 since 2006, at least from Israel's perspective, because it's not a Chapter 7 power, so it doesn't have the authority to implement its mission by using force. So that has been an issue, and means that more than ever it requires the cooperation of Hezbollah and non-state armed actors in achieving its mission. So it's been mainly conducting monitoring exercises and also helping to create some sort of dialogue or relay messages between Israel and Hezbollah and Lebanon to try to prevent conflict in that sense. But one way in which I think that UNIFIL could be quite useful in the coming period is that if there is genuine political will in Lebanon to implement this agreement, and if Hezbollah is willing to cooperate, then one thing that UNIFIL does have, which the Lebanese army desperately needs, is manpower. So there are thousands of UN peacekeepers who are based in southern Lebanon, and if they receive the authorization from the Lebanese government, could play a more active role in supporting it in terms of locating weapons and dismantling them safely. So while UNIFIL has faced a lot of criticism, not just from Israel, but also from Hezbollah and other actors in Lebanon at certain times, I do think in the coming period, if there's a genuine shift in the way that Lebanon and Hezbollah wants to implement this agreement, then UNIFIL could play some kind of bigger support role in that.
Great. Heiko, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I mean, I think 2 points. I think first of all, we are back to the Lebanese army that way, because in the end of the day, I mean, it's quite clear from the text of the ceasefire now and from 1701. I mean, UNIFIL needs the Lebanese army as a partner. And so the moment the Lebanese army becomes more efficient, is more present, UNIFIL also can play a bigger role. I mean, I think the Israeli frustration with UNIFIL mostly came from a place where Israel wanted to read things in 1701 that were simply not in there, and then like accused UNIFIL of not doing what Israel wanted it to do, but that was just not in their mandate. So. And to the extent that they can do it, it has to be done with the Lebanese army. And so this Lebanese army needs to be funded. And this Lebanese army needs to have gas in their cars, or else they cannot go to UNIFIL, with UNIFIL to do things. That's one. The other thing is, I think there's the mechanism, right? That famous mechanism to resolve the conflicts, find or address violations, decide what violations are to begin with, and UNIFIL is one of the parties in that mechanism, committee, or I don't know what it is, and in fact, UNIFIL has been the party that has been hosting the previous mechanism. Was a tripartite mechanism with UNIFIL, Israel, and the Lebanese in there, purely military level, no political level. There was really a lot of technicalities were involved. Now this has been upgraded. This potentially has been upgraded. So if this actually this mechanism becomes really active, if they actually have physical meetings, to discuss stuff, I mean, that puts UNIFIL in a very different place. Then they are hosting it. They have the knowledge on the ground. They have the maps. They have the men to actually go and go to a location and say, okay, let's see what happened here. The Israelis are saying this, the Lebanese are saying that. Let's see what actually happened here. Let's see what is here. If that mechanism takes on this very active role, which I think would be very positive, and there's a precedent for that, for them doing that, for a previous body back between 96 and 2000 played this very active role in dealing with these violations. Then actually UNIFIL could become much more valuable to keep this ceasefire stable.
Okay, thank you for that, Heiko. So here is a slightly long question, so bear with me. To what extent is Iran's long-term strategy of projecting strength through proxy still sustainable? Given Israel's sustained campaign against Hezbollah, along with the regional actors and networks supporting it, one could argue that both Iran and, by extension, Hezbollah's influence on the Lebanese domestic landscape has diminished significantly. In this context, what leverage does Hezbollah still hold to negotiate its future? David, do you want to go first?
I know for sure that Heiko has some very strong thoughts on this, but I just lead off by saying, as I mentioned earlier, that I think it may be too early to know where the chips will finally fall on that. We need more information about not just how Iran will emerge from this episode of regional conflict, but also where its priorities will lie in the future. But I'll hand it over to Heiko and Mairav to add some more points on that.
Heiko, do you want to go?
Yeah, I agree with the implied premise of the first part of the question. This Iranian strategy of forward defense, right? Like make sure that conflicts do not happen on our territory by taking them to somebody else's territory, by having Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Palestine, and having these groups in Iraq and Syria. So we confront Israel there, not on our territory. This building this regional alliance has actually turned for Iran from an asset into a liability, right? I mean, Hamas was thought to be an asset. If you now look at it, it's actually it was a liability. I mean, they've been drawn into a conflict that they certainly did not want at this point and in this form. Hezbollah has become, in a way, also a liability, right? I mean, these attacks, like they were at some point obliged to attack Israel, which was not of their choosing. So I agree with that. I mean, I agree that we should have brought in our Iran colleagues here, but it looks like this forward defense strategy may no longer be viable. I mean, if I was sitting in Tehran in the foreign ministry, or I would really think that we have a problem here, and we have to rethink this. Now, Hezbollah, when it comes to the domestic context, I think it looks a bit different. Like as long as Hezbollah and Amal together can monopolize the representation of the Shia community, they're like there's no going around them. They have bargaining power. And bargaining power. The question is bargaining power for what? What do they want going forward? But they do have bargaining power.
Thank you very much for that, Heiko. Unfortunately, I think we have to conclude here. I just wanted to mention that we have a Lebanese diplomat with us, Chantal Bassem, that would have liked to come in with an intervention, which we won't have room for. But she has left this in writing in the Q&A or the chat exchange here. So we will promise you that we will take it on board for our colleagues to read through properly, and perhaps there can be a further conversation offline at another date. But thank you very much for doing that, and sorry for not having the technical capacity to field it. I also want to draw your attention to our latest piece on this, which the three colleagues in front of you have contributed to on the ceasefire deal. So it's a longer Q&A that goes through some of the issues that we have discussed and has also further details. You can find it on our website, and the link is also in the chat here. Thank you so much for joining us, and we hope to see you next time. Thank you, and good evening.
Thanks, Lahib.
Thanks, everybody. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Good night.